Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons, and we're going to talk about Deborah Ann Woll's absolutely historic interview about Dungeons & Dragons with John Bernthal. So you can see the link below for this. You don't have to watch that, but I highly recommend you do, but you don't have to interrupt your flow here. I'll tell you all about it, so that you'll understand it. And today what we're going to talk about is the way that Deborah Ann Woll introducing John Bernthal to Dungeons & Dragons canon. Is what she did canon? I want to explore that, okay? All right, so let's go ahead. Let's talk about this. So Deborah Ann Woll, who's she? So first of all, Deborah Ann Woll is the secretary in Daredevil and Daredevil Reunited. I think, Daredevil Reloaded, the new Daredevil show that's coming on Disney Plus, right? John Bernthal, he played the Punisher, and he played I think his name was Frank on The Walking Dead. He's also in The Bear. He plays the brother who self-deleted himself. He's phenomenal. He's an incredible actor. He's really, really good actor. Really serious guy. Really takes his craft very serious. And he had Deborah Ann Woll on his podcast. So who is John Bernthal? He is pure actor, pure Hollywood, pure muggle. What do I mean by muggle? The last person in the world who would give Dungeons & Dragons a chance. This guy was like the jock in high school. Hey, everybody, you coming to the kegger on Friday? Hope to see you there, man. And the dude who would knock, and if you said, hey, you want to play Dungeons & Dragons? He would knock the book out of your hands, right? Like that's John Bernthal, right? Just the absolute most muggle dude possible. Never played Dungeons & Dragons. And when you looked at him, you didn't have to wonder if he had ever played Dungeons & Dragons. He's like, oh yeah, I'm a hardcore dude. I don't carry an umbrella. That kind of guy. You know what I mean? Like, never played Dungeons & Dragons. I don't imagine nothing. Everything's real, man. Just complete muggle, right? And I'm not trying, and I love John Bernthal. I'm not trying to be dismissive of him. I'm trying to get you to understand that what Deborah Ann Woll does is really important, okay? So Deborah Ann Woll is a Hollywood actress, right? A real one, for realsies, right? Like, and you're like, well, why you got to say for realsies? Matthew Mercer is not a Hollywood actor, right? He's a voice actor. Those guys are like, they don't get invited to the parties in Hollywood. It's different, right? It's different, right? Matthew Mercer is not a Hollywood star. He's a voice actor, okay? You don't get it twisted. They're different levels, right? So, and what I'm saying is, Deborah Ann Woll ain't that deep into Hollywood, but she was also in True Blood, okay? She's a real actress, right? Matthew Mercer isn't a real actor, right? He's, been in a couple things here and there, right? He's the greatest dungeon master in the world. Not trying to insult him. I'm just saying he's not real Hollywood. Okay, he's Hollywood adjacent, okay? All right. Deborah Ann Woll goes on John Bernthal's podcast, and they do a real podcast. They sit down, and they're talking at length. I think it's an hour and 15 minutes total, right? And it's not all about Dungeons & Dragons. And she breaks it down with John Bernthal, and this is for realsies. And if you know podcast culture, they want to get to a real discussion. They want to get deep, right? And they want to, kind of pull, it's almost like couch work. Have you heard that, that term? Oh, doing the work, right? Somebody was sitting on a couch scribbling away on a notepad saying, oh, you need to do the work. It's a lot like that. Right? So and then, oh, here's my bill for $200 for the hour that we just spent. Yes, I did answer a lot of your questions with questions. That kind of stuff, right? You know what I mean? Yeah. All right. Okay. So Deborah Ann Woll, he goes deep, and he's like, what's your jam? What do you really like? And she's like, I'm really into Dungeons & Dragons. And he's like, oh, that's okay. And she could tell automatically. He gives his muggle shrug. Oh, I don't know what that is. That sounds like nerd stuff to me, right? And Deborah Ann Woll does something powerful. She says, hey, you want to play Dungeons & Dragons? And he's like, and he literally kind of just kind of stutters and stammers because he doesn't want to say yes, right? And she's like, no. Right now, do you want to play Dungeons & Dragons right now? Right? And a lot of people are talking about this because this is huge. This is absolutely huge in the history of Dungeons & Dragons. And he's like, well, okay. And you can also tell that Deborah Ann Woll trapped him, right? Like, if she had been like, hey, buddy, you want to come to my Dungeons & Dragons game? You know, John Bernthal would have given the Hollywood, yeah, let's do that, man. Let's get some Zimas. We'll be there. Oh, it's going to be awesome. And then, you know, doesn't call, you know, like, doesn't text back when the text doesn't pick up when the call comes through, you know. See you on set on Monday. Oh, did I miss your D&D thing? You know, like, she realizes she's never going to get him to a Dungeons & Dragons table. But this gets really wild what she does. She's like, do you want to do it right now? And she trapped him with the podcast, right? Because he would have looked like, I ain't going to say the word. But he would have looked like, yeah, if he had said no. He would have looked, it would look like he was a coward, right? He would have looked, yeah, he would look like that, right? Okay. So he's like, oh, okay, you know, and he's kind of thinking, oh, this is for the podcast. Let's get some juice, you know, let's get something interesting. Got to do it for the podcast. Let's go, right? And a lot of people on podcasts are like, oh yeah, I wouldn't do this in my regular life, but for the podcast, sure, let's do it, right? It's all content, right? Like, and so John Bernthal, then she's like, okay, you're in a forest, and you have an arrow, you have a bow and quiver, you have a bow on your back and a quiver at your side, and you have a sword at your waist, right? And you're in a forest, and you hear a sound 40 feet away. And he's like, oh, well, I need to determine what that is. I'm going to see if I can take a good look, right? And she's like, that's a perception check. And I was like, what's happening right now? She doesn't have a character sheet. She doesn't have dice. What the heck is happening? They can't play Dungeons & Dragons because she doesn't have dice and he doesn't have a character sheet. He doesn't have a name, right? But she goes forward and she says, you know what? She says, that's a perception check. Let's make the roll. 13. You rolled a 13, right? That's good. All you needed was a 10. You made it, right? And you realize it's a bugbear. And now you see this thing. It's as big as a bear, but it has the face of an owl, right? Do you approach it? Do you draw your bow? Do you draw your sword? And he's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna approach it carefully, right? And he's like, oh, I'm gonna lift my bow. And she's like, you just played Dungeons & Dragons. And he's like, what? All right, like, you know, she did it. She had him play Dungeons & Dragons, and they had nothing. No papers, no pencils, no dice, nothing that is said in the Dungeon Master Guide that you need, or in the PHB, right? But here's the kicker. One, I'm ahead of you. Catch up, right? There is a version of the Dungeons & Dragons rules that talks about not using dice. You know where it's at? It's in the young adults version of Dungeons & Dragons. These books that present Dungeons & Dragons, they're like what you would find in a library. They look like a hardback novel, but very thin. Okay, there's about 6 or 7 of them now, right? It's called the Young Adventurers, you know, Dungeons & Dragons Guide. I have all of them. They're brilliant. I love them. But in the very back, there's like 2 pages that are like, hey, we know you just got this from the library and you're 10, right? So what are you going to do? You just read about Dungeons & Dragons. You're all excited, but you don't have what you need to play. Well, here's how you play without dice, without paper, without pencil, without anything you would need, right? Because they know people are doing it, because half of them have done it themselves, right? And what's wild is I already feel like, in my humble opinion, this is already canon through that book. But here's why when Deborah Ann Woll gets into it, is it canon? I think it is. And the reason why is you don't know this. Deborah Ann Woll is a canon Dungeons & Dragons author. She wrote an entire adventure that is canon, is on Dungeons & Dragons Beyond. She wrote it, designed it, the whole kit and caboodle, right? It's all there. It's all real. It's for realsies, right? And it is pretty astounding. And what's really interesting is she's a canon author, right? She's not just some scrub dungeon master rolling up, you know, and saying, oh, I wonder if this will work. She is a canon Dungeons & Dragons author, right? Which in my opinion means that she's authorized to create a new canon way to play Dungeons & Dragons that actually completely spoons with what's already been presented in the Young Adventurers edition, which I believe is an actual, for realsies, edition of Dungeons and Dragons, right? This is pretty astounding. It is incredibly astounding, right? Just the way that all this works. And so the reality is, after all said and done, you reach this point where you are, arriving at a canon way to introduce and play Dungeons and Dragons. Now, the ramifications of this are deep, very deep, right? But I'm answering the question. So first of all, did John Bernthal and Deborah and Woll play Dungeons and Dragons? Absolutely, 100% yes. Was it a canon way to play Dungeons and Dragons without any of the things you need? Yes, 100%. 100%, right? I am so excited about this. I'm so excited about Deborah and Woll. I'm so excited about just doing something that really should have been done a long time ago and showing the absolute best possible way to introduce a new person to Dungeons & Dragons. It is phenomenal. I was blown away when I saw this. Just absolutely gobsmacked, right? You've got to check this out. It is absolutely brilliant. It is truly incredible, in my humble opinion. Every single word you just heard is my humble opinion. The important part is when I get to hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a fetch millennium.